Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first part in this series on academic pathways. So I hope you will find this set of presentations helpful in preparing for your grade 9 pathways courses coming next September. Now, I do want to start with a warning. I strongly recommend you watch these videos with some colleagues. And what you should do is create a Zoom meeting and invite your teaching colleagues to it. As long as you can get at least one other person, that'll be great. Then one person from that group plays the video and shares their screen with everybody else. And then whenever you like, pause the video to talk and discuss the ideas that come up. And then feel free to contact me if you have more questions, or sign up for one of my discussion sessions that focuses on each video or presentation. That way, you will get the most out of these presentations. Now, I'd like to start just by giving you a bit of background. At my school, we've been running our grade 9 courses in the Pathways model for the past 3 years. And so we designed a science course to meet the needs of this wide range of students. And the set of videos is going to share with you the ideas that we used to design our grade 9 science course. Each of these presentations will focus on some of the big ideas. The first one is all about assessment. The second one about learning habits and behaviors. The third presentation about motivation. And the fourth presentation about identity and belonging. And in each presentation, we start off with a quick look at the big ideas. So we explore ideas from the science of learning, and then we see how those translate into pedagogical strategies, and then finish off with very clear, concrete examples from the classroom. And all of the examples that I share in these presentations are available through links on my website, so you can find the teaching materials or resources that are used with those. So let's get right into things here. This session is all about assessment. And here's the big question. Why do we assess? Well, if we think about it, there's 3 common reasons. One of these reasons is to rank or to rate students. Especially if you're teaching a grade 12 course, the marks that we produce are very important for universities to rank or rate students. It's an interesting question, how much of this is needed for grade 9? Another common reason for assessing is to reward productive learning behaviors, or perhaps to punish those behaviors that are not so productive. Another common reason is to help students learn. Now, I'm not a fan of the false distinction between the words assessment and evaluation. In the English language, these are synonyms, and so I will use these words interchangeably, unless I'm speaking with an administrator. The process of assessment has a cost for teachers. And let's think about this. It costs us in terms of our preparation time, designing, writing, photocopying those assessments. It costs us in terms of our marking time. And what I'll call the haggling time. I've spent an awful lot of time just looking at students' work and trying to decide, is this really an 8 out of 10 or is it a 9 out of 10? Oh, it could go either way, but I know the student is going to bug me about it. So, what grade should I actually give them? So all of this has an energy cost for us teachers. We have a limited amount of time and energy. So I think it's really important when we think about assessment to decide what has the most bang for our energy buck. Throughout these videos, I'm going to be suggesting that you pause in certain locations and have a discussion with your colleagues. So this is a moment that would be good for such a discussion. So I'd like you to talk with your colleagues about these reasons. Why do we assess? And here's a question to help guide your discussions. But of course, you can talk about anything you like that you've seen so far in the videos. So pause the video here. Then when you're ready, you can unpause and we'll continue. Let's look at these 3 reasons for why we assess, and I'd like to share how I prioritize these. So my highest priority is helping students learn. This is where I want most of my teaching or assessing energy to go. Second place is to reward, and by this I mean rewarding productive learning behaviors. This is such an important idea that I will actually focus on it in a second presentation, the next one in this series. I've had a lot of discussions about assessment with teachers, and very often it seems like the purpose of the assessments is simply to generate enough marks to come up with a final grade for the student. So that really focuses on this first reason for assessing, and I find this the least satisfying because it has the least to do with learning. And I think it drives counterproductive behaviors in the students by emphasizing ranking or accumulating marks. We often talk about assessment for, as, or of learning, and I find these distinctions distracting. It's much more helpful if we take a careful look at the role of assessment in the learning process itself. And to do that, let's explore a little bit about how the brain works. When we think and learn, the operations of the brain can be broken down roughly into 4 regions. Now, the names of these regions of the brain is not important. What is important is what happens in each of these regions. Let's explore this. So towards the back of our brain, this is where our brain processes the inputs that come from our senses. Now, after that, the wiring in our brains sends signals to a part toward the back and the side of the brain where the brain makes sense of those inputs. So it assigns meanings to them. So that smell is the coffee in the morning. That thing outside, that's your car waiting to drive you to work. And then our brains send signals to the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain. And this is where we plan things, or where we develop abstract ideas about our world. Then next, the wiring in our brain takes signals to the top part, our motor cortex. And this is where we do things, or we carry out our plans. Together, this forms a cycle, because as soon as we do things, we receive new inputs into our brain, and this process continues. This idea is so important for learning that we give it a special name. We're going to call it the cognitive learning cycle. Now, in reality, our brain works in a much more complex way, but this is a great way of breaking down the main operations, and it helps us understand a lot about the learning process. This learning cycle needs to happen over and over again, and very rapidly, in order for us to make sense of our world. We need to complete this cycle and help our students do that. So when they take their learning, their plans and their ideas, and they do something with it physically, that becomes a stimulus, which arrives as a new input into the brain. This is where the process of assessment connects with the cognitive learning cycle, between the testing phase and between the input. Assessment is so important to the cognitive learning cycle that we should think about it this way. Assessment is learning. Without it, our students can't learn properly. So assessment should be involved in every act of learning in order to complete that cognitive learning cycle. So that helps us understand the purpose of assessment, which is to give feedback. And that feedback gets picked up in the cycle. It's assigned meaning. And then it goes back to the plans and ideas, where the students alter the plans, adjust their abstract ideas as they start to figure stuff out, as they learn. So if we think about why we assess, the main reason is to provide feedback for that learning cycle. And this feedback is the most effective when it is immediate and continuous, and allows the students to improve. So it keeps that cycle working. Feedback that is provided even a day later or a week later when a project test is returned is of very little use for the purpose of learning. Now, the assessments also provide rewards for this cycle in our brains. So we want to reward productive learning behaviors. And as I mentioned, that will be the focus of the next session. So in that case, what should we assess? Well, I like to break it down like this. We should assess the student's process of learning and doing. So science is all about doing. It's about how we figure things out. And so we should be assessing that. Science is also about understanding our world. And so how we explain things is an important part to assess. And we use science to do things, to devise products if we're building something, or solutions. And so we should assess that. Now, why does this approach to assessment work? So one reason that it works is it puts the emphasis on the learning process itself. So the assessment helps that learning process to work better. And this word improvement is one that I use an awful lot in my science classroom because that is where I want my students' thinking to be focused. This approach also works because it helps to remove the emphasis of rating students and that instinct to hunt for marks. It works because it's timely. In a well-designed learning environment, students are getting the results of that assessment, the feedback, right when they need it. And it helps them move through that cognitive learning cycle. So it works because it matches how our brains learn. So this is another good moment to pause the video and talk about this idea of immediate continuous assessment. When you're ready, you can unpause and continue. Now, as we get started in the next session, we're shifting towards the classroom examples. I'm going to present a series of examples of how we use assessment in our grade 9 science program. So you might want to pause after each of these examples and have a quick discussion with your colleagues. So you might ask questions something like this. Here we go, and feel free to pause at any time. So we mentioned that immediate and continuous feedback is important. So let's take a look at ways in which we can help this to happen in our classroom. This is the most important process for learning, and as a result, we should spend most of our assessment time and energy on this. Now, there's a really handy bonus. If you structure it well into class time, you can largely use student energy to do this, so it's not a cost for the teacher. One way of encouraging that immediate and continuous feedback is using cooperative group discussions. I talk an awful lot about this, and I can't overemphasize just how valuable this is for student learning. When students have those casual conversations or the in-depth conversations about science ideas, this is immediate feedback. And so they're right away correcting their thinking, adjusting their thinking, and that's a form of assessment. And even just those simple glances at the work of your neighbor can be enough to, oh, okay, yeah, I was on the right track. That's actually how it should go. Now I'm fine. All of these little things are what helps to make that assessment continuous and immediate. And the students really appreciate that. The last question in our first test of the course is always the same. I ask my students, in our science class, we learn in a different way than many other classes. What aspect of learning in our grade 9 science class helped you the most? Please explain. And here's what one student said.
I think working in groups helped the most because I got to hear other people's perspectives and they could help me when I'm wrong.
So this is the sharing of ideas from one group to another. They often involve short explanations or sometimes just stuff written on a whiteboard. So very quickly, you can share ideas across the classroom, and groups as a whole can get feedback on their work and benefit from the insights of other groups. This is a form of assessment. Another is class discussions. Now, this is a little bit different from what you might be thinking. Now, it is teacher-led, but it only lasts for a few minutes at a time. And what makes this an effective form of assessment in the sense of helping students to correct or improve their thinking or understanding is if it clarifies a key point that students are already working on. So in my class, students are working vigorously in their groups, and at a key moment, I will pause their discussions to have this teacher-led discussion. So we've hit a critical idea, we quickly talk about it, which hopefully clarifies it in their minds, then there's the assessment, and then they move on. A very powerful form of assessment is the type that students do themselves. Students in general don't improve, or they improve very little, unless they learn to look critically at their own work. Otherwise, they keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And they need to learn to react productively to mistakes. If it's a negative reaction, then they don't treat mistakes as an opportunity to learn. Then they have to identify the areas to improve. And finally, they actually have to make the improvements. And if they can learn to do this regularly, then they take a big step forward into becoming independent learners. To help students do this, we use science skill rubrics. So what these are exemplars for the key skills in each of our science units. Here I have an example from electricity. So for our charge diagrams, as an example, the main idea of these diagrams is to show the positions of the positive and negative particles in the object. Then I show them a good diagram or example of that. Then there's a list of the details that they should remember. And so when it comes time to use the science skill rubrics, the students will have just completed a task themselves. And then I will ask them, okay, turn to your rubric page and compare your work against the rubric, or use the rubric as a guide to assess how well you did it. And here's the important part. Make improvements using a different color, or check mark it if it's fine. That idea of the different color is really helpful. First of all, it helps to highlight in the students' minds the elements that they need to watch out for next time, to remember from this improvement process. And at a glance, when I look at their page, I can see that they've completed the improvement process using the rubric, and I can also see what they have changed. Their original work is still clear. In the example that I have here, this is actually from my grade 11 physics course. I didn't have a grade 9 science one handy. And you can see these corrections and improvements that were made. In the time since I scanned this image, I no longer ask my students to mark their own work. That's not a really important part as far as improvement is concerned. That's the rating side of things, which I want to de-emphasize. Now, we also build a self-assessment element into our quizzes. We have the students write the quiz, then they come to the front of the class, and there they compare their work with model solutions that I've provided for them. And they have to decide what elements of their work need to be improved based on those models. And they have to make those improvements using a different color, being sure that their original work is still visible. And here you can see my grade 9s at the front of the class. They're making their improvements to their electricity quiz. Here's an example from my grade 11 physics class, and you can see the original work of the student. In blue pen, they have added in their corrections and improvements. And in red pen, I've added in my own in addition to that. So this is actually a great insight into student thinking, because you see what ideas students do and don't recognize as needing improvement. This has been very insightful for me. To encourage their careful self-assessments, we include a couple of marks on these quizzes for the quality with which they make those improvements. So these self-assessment quizzes focus on core skills from the unit. So as a result, it's easy for us to produce lots of versions of them. And after teaching for a couple of semesters, we have quite a collection. And we allow the students an opportunity to write a new quiz if they can show me evidence that they have made improvements. So catching up on their homework, doing some extra tasks that I can check. Then if they show that, I'll grab an old quiz. It has its solution already worked out, and they're able to rewrite it and reassess those skills. We want our students to focus on improvement. Another great way for self-assessment is a peer group self-assessment. So in this model, groups write their answers to some tasks on whiteboards. And then they place these whiteboards around the room with a marker beside each. Students pick up their worksheets, and then they go around to the individual whiteboards and take a look, compare their work with what they see, and on their own page, again, make those corrections or improvements using a different color. Now, there's a whiteboard marker beside each whiteboard because there might be some elements of the solutions that are presented there that need clarifying. They could be incorrect or just unclear. And so students will circle something, and that way, after this process, we can have a quick class discussion to focus on these elements. I really like this process. It's great for dealing with homework, and I call it the homework circuit. And my students enjoy this process as well.
What helped me the most is that I can correct my homework and learn from the mistakes I did, like that I don't do them again.
So all of these assessment techniques focus on keeping this cognitive learning cycle going. and keeping it cycling as frequently as possible. It's the person who puts in the effort who does the learning. So if it's the teacher who's doing all of the correcting, doing all of the descriptive feedback on the student's work, the teacher is learning, hopefully learning about the elements that their students have difficulty with. However, we want the students to do the learning. And so the students really have to put in that effort to making the improvements in their own work. There's no other way around this if we want our students to learn and improve. They have to be putting this effort. They have to be making the improvements. This does take time, but it is extremely valuable. So this is a great moment to pause if you haven't been pausing already and talk about some of these different techniques. When you're ready, unpause and we can keep going. Let's take a quick look at my students in action. So that's a very brief look at my grade 9s as they're working away on a test. So this is what the start of our tests look like in grade 9 science. Let's think for a moment about traditional testing. In my opinion, it has very little educational value in the sense that there's very little learning or new learning that takes place as a result of the testing experience. Now, it often has that value in the first sense that we listed at the beginning, in terms of rating or ranking students, or for rewarding, but very little educational value in terms of learning. The focus is on reward and rating, which means it often produces a lot of anxiety in our students because they're worried about this judgmental aspect of it. And it requires a lot of teacher energy to design and put together. And personally, I think that this is a very unproductive use of my educational time and energy. So I want my class tests to be more meaningful and rewarding in terms of learning. So in that video, what you saw was my students going through the discussion phase of the test. So they have roughly 10 minutes and this sheet of paper that you see here. So on this page, we have the questions of the test, or at least the two main questions. The description of the question reads more like a story. There's no numbers in the question, which forces them to think about the ideas. There's a realistic picture for them to refer to. And on this page, students are welcome to jot down whatever notes they think are helpful from those discussions. They get to keep this page with them in the next part of the test. There you can see question number 2, and a reminder that there will be a few more short questions on the test that aren't appearing on the discussion page, and a reminder of our circuit symbols and some of our mathematical equations. Now, in the design of this test, the discussion phase comes first. Then next is the individual work. So after the discussions, the students adjust their seating so that they're facing the front of the class and working on their own quietly, just like in a traditional test. Now they see the exact same questions. So there's question number 1 that we saw on the discussion page. And now the responses to the question are broken up and very carefully scaffolded to help the students in their thinking. And you'll notice that there's actually quite a few steps or questions that are asked as part of this one scenario. The questions tend to focus on explanations. And one of our goals is to try to get at as much learning as possible through this one question, this one scenario. And here's another example of that, finishing it off with a calculation. So the questions that we use in these tests are realistic or more authentic style questions. These questions represent the kind of thinking that experts would use when they're approaching a novel situation. The focus of the questions tends to be on explanations. We want to see what our students understand of these situations and how well they can use their scientific ideas to explain what is going on. So there's an important shift. The shift is away from what is the knowledge associated with this unit to what can you do with this knowledge given these situations. And we were trying to assess as much learning as possible through each question. Now, all of this can be genuinely challenging for students, which is another reason why we have that discussion phase at the beginning that helps students to unpack these questions and to get comfortable with the scenario so that they're able to successfully demonstrate the knowledge that they have. So in the discussion phase, students are discussing and learning. They're making notes for their individual work phase that's coming up. We give them the formulas and symbols, and this time helps them to unpack these context-rich questions. Another really important reason for the design of this test is that it better reflects how scientific knowledge is used in the real world. If outside of school, you're given an important science-based task to complete, everybody would discuss the ideas first. You would discuss with a mentor, with a team, with your clients, and then you would do your work. Another important element of our testing process is the learning log. Every day at the end of a lesson, students complete a summary of the new skills and ideas that were introduced. And they get to use this summary, the learning log, during the test. My students are very fond of this element, and here are a few examples of their comments.
I think that using the learning log helped me the most. This is because after a lesson, I can summarize what I've learned and put it down in my own words. Also, for preparing for tests and quizzes, I can look at my learning log and review. I think that what helped me the most was that he did hands-on experiments and work every lesson instead of just learning and reading everything from a textbook. The learning log also helped me keep track of important ideas and helped me remember more. I also like that we have our learning logs during tests.
Another important part of our testing process is how we give our students feedback. So first of all, we don't correct the student work in the test. Remember that comment about effort from earlier on in this presentation. Instead, what I do is I circle or underline the elements that require improvement. When I'm marking the test, you might have noticed this, there are no individual marks for the questions or the subparts of each question. There's question number 1, no mark. Part A, B, C, no mark breakdown. So instead, we assign marks for their demonstrations of their understanding of the ideas and their ability to use their skills. And that marking happens on a separate page. This is actually the back of their discussion page. Here you can see how we break down the marks for our test. So we've broken them down into categories that make sense from the point of view of learning science. So there's communication, and then we have 3 categories connected with the electricity content. So when I mark a test and I want to give students feedback, it's helpful for me to know, okay, do they understand how a load or a source works? That's one category. What happens when you put them together into a circuit? Do they understand that? That's the next category. And then for static electricity, do they understand the behavior of charged objects and their interactions with one another? Our final category. And so this mark breakdown focuses on the ideas and skills, and it removes the focus from the number of marks per question. And so in this format, it's been very rare for a student to ask me about the mark breakdown. So the mark hunting behavior is much reduced. Now we want our tests to be a learning experience for students. So we have to build improvement into that. So when we return the test to the students, we do that without giving them the mark breakdown page. And then what students do is they take a look at what's been circled or underlined, and they complete an improvement package. This is essentially just the test again. And they take a look, they make the improvements to the parts that I've indicated. If there are sections that they did fine on, they just check it off on the improvement page, they're good. And then they've made that important effort to improve based on the test feedback. What are the students' thoughts about this testing process? Well, I asked my students to jot them down, and here is one group. I'd like to highlight one comment here that they made.
We learn concepts as a group, so group work on tests introduces familiarity to combat test anxiety.
Here's another group, and let's take a look at one of their comments.
Tests should be as much of a learning experience as the lessons.
So our testing procedures have evolved a lot over the years. They went from a content focus to an application focus. We don't have to ask knowledge questions on the tests because we see all of that content in how they use the knowledge in the application style questions. It's simply not necessary. We don't try to cover the entire unit. Instead, we focus on the key ideas. And in fact, the mark breakdown that we've put together for the tests helps us to do that. And instead of having many short questions, we just have a few questions that are longer and richer. So the test changes from a superficial survey of the course or that unit into an exploration of the student's deeper understanding and their ability to use the ideas. And the traditional test is 100% individual work. But because cooperative group work is such an important part of our learning process, we think it's absolutely essential that it remains a part of our evaluation process. So our tests start with collaborative work. And in my old tests, all that careful work that I used to do, jotting down my comments, the feedback, was largely ignored. Students would look at the mark and essentially toss the test away. That has now changed, and the test is indeed a source of learning and improvement for the students. And so here's a key idea from all of this. Assessment drives the learning habits and behaviors of our students. And so our assessment choices in the course have a huge effect on how our students behave and learn. And that, in fact, will be the focus of the next presentation, where we carefully look at how we develop learning habits and behaviors. And in particular, this topic of assessment will continue as I focus on the mastery approach to learning that we take. So let's remember that assessment is learning. It's something that is absolutely fundamental to the learning process, as we saw in the cognitive learning cycle. And assessment is best, so it is most useful when it is immediate, when it promotes improvement, and when it matches the needs of our brains. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, but hopefully not to the end of your discussions. So I encourage you to continue your conversations with your colleagues here. So if you go to my website, you'll find links to all the examples that I shared. And I certainly hope you check out the other presentations that are part of this series.